My name is Alex Rivera. I'm 34 years old. This happened one autumn when I decided to take a break from the relentless pace of city life and head into the wilds of Northern California. I'd been planning a quiet retreat for months, but life, as it often does, had other plans. I, along with my two closest companions, Nina Coleman, whose gentle spirit and intuitive nature had always fascinated me, and Marcus Thompson, a daredevil whose thirst for adrenaline often bordered on recklessness, set out for a weekend getaway that promised solitude, scenic beauty, and a chance to escape our daily struggles. We had rented an old RV, a clunky vehicle that had seen better days, to serve as our temporary home. I was the one keeping track of the itinerary, the one trying to keep our plans organized. Little did I know that our expedition would soon evolve into a nightmare. We were heading for the Mount Shasta region, a place draped in natural beauty and steeped in local lore. I'd heard whispers about ancient legends and supernatural occurrences in the area. A restless spirit, some said, born of an old witch trial involving a 19th century herbalist accused of dark arts. Although I was always the skeptic, dismissing ghost stories as fanciful fabrications, something about the promise of a remote campsite near a trail ominously called Blackwood Trail had an inexplicable pull for all of us. It was as if fate had set our course long before we even loaded our gear into the RV. The journey itself was a mixed bag. Our RV's engine coughed and spluttered as we climbed the winding mountain roads. The vehicle's age was evident in every creak and groan, and the leaky water system became a recurring inconvenience. I spent much of the drive wrangling with the failing generator, its intermittent hum punctuating our conversation with uneasy gaps. Marcus, ever the optimist in the face of adversity, joked about our vintage adventure mobile, while Nina's quiet eyes betrayed her concern. I found myself torn between practical annoyance and an inexplicable sense of foreboding as the forest canopy thickened and the crisp mountain air enveloped us. We finally arrived at a secluded clearing near Blackwood Trail. The campsite was tucked away from the well-trodden paths, surrounded by towering pines and ancient redwoods that whispered of centuries past. The land felt sacred, almost hallowed, and I couldn't help but notice strange symbols carved into the bark of some trees. At first glance, they appeared to be traditional Native American markings, but as I examined them closer, I detected odd, arcane designs woven in among them, a melding of indigenous art and something far more esoteric. I dismissed the thought as a trick of my overactive imagination, but Nina's wide-eyed look told me she sensed something amiss. That first night, the RV's flickering lights provided little comfort. The generator sputtered again, plunging us into intermittent darkness. Outside, the forest was alive with sounds that felt out of place, a low, rhythmic hum that resembled chanting, punctuated by the occasional eerie laughter that sent chills down my spine. I lay awake, eyes straining to see beyond the small circle of light cast by the RV's dashboard, wondering if my mind was playing tricks on me. Marcus, always ready with a quip, tried to lighten the mood by suggesting we were in the company of friendly spirits, but his laugh died in his throat when a distant rustle near the back of the vehicle turned into something unmistakably deliberate. Over the following day, the tension among us became palpable. I took it upon myself to check and double-check the RV's equipment, repairing what little I could, while Marcus and Nina set out on a brief hike along a nearby trail to explore the mysterious carvings we had noticed earlier. Marcus's exuberance was infectious at first. He led the way with a swagger, his eyes scanning the undergrowth as if expecting something extraordinary to leap out at him. Nina, however, moved more slowly, her gaze lingering on the weathered tree trunks as if trying to decipher secrets hidden within their bark. "Alex," Nina said softly during our hike, "do you ever feel like this place has a memory? Like it's alive with the voices of those who came before us?" I hesitated, choosing my words carefully. "I'm not one for ghosts or memories, Nina. It's just a forest, beautiful and ancient. Sometimes nature does things that we don't immediately understand, but that doesn't mean it's anything more than nature." She smiled gently, but her eyes remained distant, as though she was already conversing with someone I couldn't see. That evening, as we settled back into the cramped confines of our RV, a series of strange events began to converge. I was reading through a dog-eared guidebook on local legends while Marcus fiddled with a portable radio, trying to coax a stable signal out of it. Suddenly, the RV's electrical system faltered once more, and the vehicle was engulfed in darkness. I could hear Marcus cursing softly as he tried to reset the generator, and Nina's breathing quickened in the silence. In that oppressive darkness, a sound began to emerge from outside, a low, almost hypnotic hum, as if someone were chanting in a language lost to time. I crept to the window, straining my eyes to see through the murky gloom. There, amid the dancing shadows of the towering trees, I caught a glimpse of a figure. It was tall, gaunt, and moved with an unsettling grace. The figure seemed to be standing in the distance, its presence commanding yet intangible, like a ghost hovering just at the edge of perception. My heart pounded in my chest as I signaled for Nina and Marcus. "Did you see that?" I whispered, my voice barely audible over the rhythmic thumping of my pulse. Marcus grinned nervously. "Maybe it's just a hiker. You know, one of those folks who likes to scare people for fun." Nina shook her head, her expression serious. "There's something not right here, Alex. I've read about old legends from these parts, about a spirit that haunts these woods. They say it's the restless soul of a woman, a herbalist accused of witchcraft. I always thought it was just a myth, but now, I'm not so sure." I wanted to dismiss her concerns as superstitious nonsense, but the evidence of our surroundings was hard to ignore. The carvings, the inexplicable chanting, the sense of being watched, each element stacked upon the other until rational explanations seemed increasingly inadequate. In the depths of the night, as I sat alone with my thoughts, I could not shake the feeling that we had trespassed on a boundary we were never meant to cross. The next morning, as the first light of dawn filtered through the fog, we convened to discuss our next steps. Marcus was still jittery from the previous night's events, his earlier bravado replaced by a wary caution. Nina, ever the believer, proposed that we try to learn more about the local lore, perhaps by speaking to someone in the nearby town or visiting the local historical society. I, meanwhile, was determined to inspect the area around our campsite, hoping to find logical explanations for the strange phenomena. With the RV's generator sputtering a reluctant hum, we set off on foot along a narrow path that wound through a copse of ancient trees. As we walked, I could feel the weight of unseen eyes upon us. The forest, which had seemed so benign in daylight, now pulsed with a hidden life. At intervals, the soft sound of a child's laughter, barely audible, echoed through the trees only to vanish when we turned our heads in search of its source. Marcus kept a nervous eye on his surroundings, his earlier dismissals of supernatural occurrences giving way to a palpable anxiety. Nina, however, seemed to be in a trance, her gaze fixed on a series of particularly intricate carvings on a fallen log. The symbols were a mix of Native American motifs and strange, otherworldly designs that I couldn't quite place. "There," Nina whispered, almost to herself. "These markings, they tell a story of pain and loss. It's as if someone tried to warn us." I knelt beside her, running my fingers over the rough bark. The carvings were fresh in some places, as if they had been made recently, yet the style was ancient. Who would be doing this? I asked, the logical part of my mind struggling to keep up with the rising tide of dread. Before Nina could answer, a sudden gust of wind tore through the forest, scattering leaves and stirring the branches in a frenzy. In that brief moment of chaos, I thought I saw movement at the edge of my vision, a tall, shadowy figure darting between the trees. I called out to Marcus, but he was already a few paces ahead, his expression a mixture of defiance and fear. "Probably just a deer or something," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. By mid-afternoon, we found ourselves back at the RV, the mood heavy with an unspoken understanding that our excursion was taking a turn for the worse. We decided to take a break and have lunch, trying to shake off the oppressive atmosphere that seemed to cling to the very air. As we ate, the conversation turned to the local legend that Nina had mentioned the previous night. According to what she had read, the region's dark history was marked by the persecution of a wise herbalist. a woman who was rumored to possess the power to heal and harm in equal measure. Branded a witch by the fearful townsfolk, she had been executed in a brutal public trial, and her dying curse was said to have cursed the land with her restless spirit. Over time, this tale had mutated, interweaving with indigenous myths about protective spirits and vengeful ghosts. Marcus scoffed at the story, but I noticed his eyes were clouded with uncertainty. "Legends have a way of growing, Alex," he said quietly. "Sometimes they're rooted in a kernel of truth. I just hope we're not about to become part of one." That night, with the RV's interior dimly lit by a few flickering candles, we huddled together, the atmosphere charged with tension. The generator had been temperamental all day, and as the shadows deepened, the familiar hum of the forest returned. I lay awake listening to the sound of my own breathing mingling with the distant haunting echoes of what might have been chanting. At one point I heard a scraping sound on the outside, like something or someone trying to claw its way through the thin walls of the RV. I called out to Nina and Marcus, but my voice was swallowed by the darkness. Marcus, always the one to confront danger head-on, decided that the next step was clear. We needed to confront whatever was out there. "I'm not about to sit here and wait for a ghost to come break our legs," he declared, though his voice trembled with barely contained fear. Nina, on the other hand, insisted that we approach the situation with caution, to respect the spirit, rather than challenge it head-on. I found myself caught between these conflicting impulses. One part of me demanded to dismiss the supernatural, to rationalize it away, while another part, deep down, recognized that we were dealing with something that defied explanation. The tension reached its peak one night when the RV's generator died completely, plunging us into total darkness. With no power and no modern distractions, we were forced to rely on the natural sounds of the forest, which now took on an almost malevolent quality. I sat in the driver's seat, the engine silent, listening intently. Suddenly, through the pitch-black void, I heard it, a deep guttural moan followed by the unmistakable sound of heavy footsteps on the gravel. I could feel my heart pounding so hard I was sure the others could hear it too. Marcus grabbed a flashlight and flung open the door, the beam slicing through the darkness. For a brief, horrifying moment, I saw a silhouette standing at the edge of the clearing, a figure that was too tall, too distorted, its form shifting as if made of smoke and shadow. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, it was gone, swallowed by the night. Nina's eyes welled with tears as she whispered, "It's her. I'm sure it's her. The witch." I didn't know what to believe anymore. Was it really the ghost of the herbalist, cursed to roam these woods, or was it some manifestation of our collective fear, a hallucination born of isolation and the failure of our aging RV? I couldn't decide, but one thing was clear. Our presence here had stirred something ancient and dangerous. Desperate for answers, the following morning we ventured into the nearby town, a small, weathered community that clung to its old ways. We spoke with an elderly man at the local historical society, a repository of stories and local lore. He confirmed Nina's suspicions, recounting tales of a spirit known to roam the forests around Mount Shasta, a spirit that was said to appear as a dark, shifting figure, often accompanied by the sorrowful laughter of a child. Many have ventured into these woods and returned with stories of inexplicable encounters, he told us in a low, gravelly voice. But heed this. You must treat the land with respect or suffer the consequences. Armed with this grim knowledge, we returned to our campsite with a renewed sense of caution. That night, as the sky deepened to an inky black and the wind whispered through the trees, we decided to perform a small ritual. Nina had found a reference in an old text, a symbolic offering that might appease a restless spirit. It was a desperate, unorthodox measure, born out of equal parts superstition and a need to reclaim control over our rapidly spiraling situation. We gathered the necessary items, a small bundle of sage, a few candles, and a handful of wildflowers we'd picked earlier in the day. In the quiet clearing behind the RV, we arranged the items in a circle around one of the ancient carved trees. The wind had died down to a respectful hush, as if nature itself was holding its breath. I took a deep breath and began the ritual, speaking words that I barely understood but hoped would bridge the gap between our world and whatever lurked in the shadows. As I chanted, the temperature around us plummeted, and the darkness seemed to thicken. Nina's eyes glistened with both fear and determination, and even Marcus, normally so bold, appeared subdued and solemn. In that moment, I felt as though we had opened a door to something vast and incomprehensible, a door that might lead to our salvation or our doom. Then, without warning, the figure materialized before us. It was the same shadowy, shifting presence we had seen before, but now it was unmistakably close. The air vibrated with a low, menacing growl, and the ground itself seemed to tremble under its weight. I felt a searing cold invade my very soul as the spirit's eyes, if they could be called that, burned with an otherworldly intensity. The entity's form wavered between that of a disfigured woman and something far more monstrous, a creature born of ancient rage and sorrow. Marcus, driven by his habitual daredevil nature, stepped forward. "Show yourself, damn it!" he shouted, his voice echoing through the clearing. But his defiance was his undoing. The spirit's anger seemed to boil over in that moment. With a violent burst of energy, it lunged at Marcus, its formless hand striking him with a force that sent him reeling backward. I screamed as I watched him crash to the ground, his body convulsing in pain as if trying to break free from invisible bonds. Nina rushed to his side, tears streaming down her face as she tried to staunch the flow of blood from a deep gash on his forehead. "Marcus, stay with us, please," she pleaded, her voice trembling with despair and fear. I knelt beside him, feeling utterly helpless in the face of this overwhelming horror. The spirit hovered above us, its presence pulsating with malevolence, as if it was feeding on our terror. For what felt like an eternity, the clearing was bathed in a suffocating silence broken only by the ragged breaths of my friend and the low, mournful sounds emanating from the entity. I tried to steady myself, my mind racing through every rational explanation I'd ever known, but nothing could dispel the raw, visceral terror that gripped me. In that desperate moment, I recalled the old man's words about respecting the land and its ancient spirits. With no other recourse, I signaled to Nina to continue the ritual, to speak the words that might appease the entity. With trembling fingers, she extended the wildflowers and sage toward the spirit, her voice rising in a soft, pleading chant. I joined her, my own voice cracking as I recited the incantations we'd barely understood. The spirit's form wavered, its aggressive posture softening ever so slightly. For a brief moment, the air held its breath as though waiting for the outcome of our desperate supplication. But the respite was short-lived. The entity's eyes flared with an intensity that cut through the dim light, and with a shriek that seemed to shake the very earth, it surged forward once more. I lunged to shield Nina and Marcus, pulling them close as the spirit's force slammed into us. The impact was like a physical blow, a surge of cold, dark energy that left me reeling. In that chaotic, disorienting moment, time itself seemed to fracture. I remember the sound of cracking wood, the taste of metal in my mouth, and a profound sense of inevitability. When the tumult finally subsided, I found myself alone in the clearing. Nina was there, her face ashen, and Marcus lay motionless, his breathing shallow and ragged. I rushed to his side, checking for signs of life, while Nina's soft cries filled the night. Marcus had been gravely injured. His skin was pale, and a deep, relentless wound marked his side. The spirit, however, was nowhere to be seen, vanished as quickly as it had appeared, leaving behind only the echo of its malevolent presence. Over the following hours, we did everything we could to stabilize Marcus, our earlier bravado completely replaced by a desperate need to survive. We managed to call for help using an old cell phone with a barely charged battery, and soon enough, the sound of distant sirens broke through the oppressive silence of the forest. Emergency responders arrived, their faces grim as they assessed Marcus's condition. Despite our efforts, the damage was too severe. Marcus's injuries inflicted by that dark force were fatal. I stood there, numb, as Marcus slipped away, his last breath mingling with the cool night air. In the days that followed, Nina and I were left to grapple with the aftermath of that harrowing night. The authorities found no physical evidence of any assailant. Marcus's injuries, though unmistakable in their brutality, could not be traced to any conventional source. The local historical society, too, offered little comfort, just more cryptic stories about a spirit of vengeance tied to the ancient witch trials and indigenous lore of the region. I spent countless sleepless nights revisiting every detail of that night, questioning whether our actions had provoked an unspeakable force or merely revealed its hidden nature. Nina, in her own quiet way, began to delve deeper into the lore. She visited local libraries, consulted with elders in the community, and pored over ancient manuscripts, searching for clues that might explain the spirit's origins and its inexplicable wrath. I, on the other hand, found myself caught between lingering disbelief and a newfound respect for forces beyond our control. My once unshakable rationality had crumbled, replaced by a sobering realization. Some mysteries, some horrors, defy explanation. The grief of losing Marcus was compounded by a gnawing sense of guilt. I questioned every decision we'd made, the choice to ignore the subtle warnings, the insistence on challenging a power we barely understood. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face contorted in pain, and I heard the echo of that desperate, sorrowful cry in the clearing. I began to understand that nature, steeped in ancient memory and spiritual significance, was not something to be trifled with. In the weeks that followed our escape from Mount Shasta, Nina and I returned to civilization-changed men. The RV, now abandoned in a field as we were towed away by a local tow truck, became a symbol of our folly, a relic of an encounter that defied logical explanation. Nina continued her research, determined to document every detail, every legend that might shed light on the malevolent force we had encountered. I found solace, however imperfect, in writing down my experiences, hoping that by capturing every raw emotion and every vivid detail, I might somehow exorcise the memories that haunted me. As time passed, I occasionally wondered if the spirit still roamed the darkened woods of Mount Shasta, its sorrowful presence lingering in the echoes of ancient trees and forgotten trails. I often thought of Marcus, his laughter and fearless nature now a memory that stung with both fondness and regret. In my quieter moments, I would sometimes hear the ghostly laughter of a child, or catch a glimpse of a shadow at the edge of my vision, and I'd feel that familiar chill, a reminder that the land was alive with secrets, both wondrous and terrible. I have come to accept that some experiences cannot be neatly rationalized, that the line between myth and reality is as thin as the whisper of the wind. The events on that fateful night taught me a painful lesson about respect. Respect for the power of ancient lore, for the memories etched into the land, and for the forces that lurk beyond the veil of our understanding. Though I strive to maintain a semblance of normalcy, the scars of that encounter remain, etched into my soul like the strange carvings on the trees of Blackwood Trail. Now, whenever I find myself in a quiet moment, I think back to that cold, starless night in the shadow of Mount Shasta. I remember the desperate, echoing chant of the wind, the solemn faces of Nina and Marcus as we faced the unearthly fury of a force that should have been left undisturbed. I remember the bitter taste of fear and loss, the grief of a friend taken too soon, and the stark realization that our world is far more mysterious and dangerous than we ever dared to imagine. In the end, I continue to live with that haunting memory, a reminder that some corners of the earth are guarded by forces beyond our comprehension. And as I write these words, I can't help but wonder if somewhere out there, in the depths of an ancient forest or along a forgotten trail, the spirit still waits, watching, mourning, and perhaps even seeking redemption in the silent echoes of the past. That is the story of our ill-fated journey into the heart of darkness, a journey that started with the promise of adventure and solitude, but ended in a confrontation with something truly otherworldly. I share it not to incite fear, but as a cautionary tale. Respect the legends, honor the past, and never underestimate the power that dwells within the shadows of the land. My name is Julian Hart. I'm 42 years old. This happened one late autumn when I decided to escape the weight of my past and seek solace in the solitude of the Mendocino National Forest. I had left behind a life cluttered with regret and unresolved guilt, a life that had once seen me as an investigative journalist chasing hard truths, and now I was a man in search of redemption. I hit the open road in my aging RV, a clunky relic with flickering lights, a temperamental engine, and a radio that seemed determined to capture nothing but static. The vehicle's shortcomings mirrored my own inner disrepair, and as I drove north into the vast, silent wilderness of Northern California, I couldn't help but feel that I was headed into a place where time itself had slowed down. The RV rattled along narrow, winding roads until I finally reached a remote clearing on the Mendocino Ridge, a forgotten spot where the forest stretched out in a dense, endless sea of towering pines and ancient redwoods. The land was quiet, almost reverentially so, and the chill in the air hinted at the coming winter. I set up camp in a small flat area that offered a panoramic view of the rugged coastline in the distance, the crashing waves a constant, distant reminder of nature's immutable power. That first evening, as I sat by a small portable stove warming a cup of coffee, I felt an eerie stillness descend over the clearing. The RV's old generator coughed intermittently to life, its sporadic hum and stuttering flashes of light doing little to dispel the oppressive darkness that was slowly creeping in. I couldn't shake the feeling that the forest was watching me. There was something in the quiet rustling of the leaves and the whisper of the wind that stirred memories of long-forgotten stories of tragedy, injustice, and spirits that refused to rest. While preparing for bed, I decided to take a short walk around the perimeter of my makeshift camp. The forest floor was littered with fallen needles and the detritus of autumn, and each step stirred echoes of the past. It was then that I noticed something glinting in the weak light of dusk near a cluster of scrubby bushes. Curious, I stooped down and unearthed an old, tarnished locket. Its surface was pitted with age, and when I pried it open, I found inside a faded photograph of a young woman. Her eyes, though blurred by time, held a haunting sorrow that sent a shiver down my spine. I pocketed the locket, unaware that it would soon become a tangible link between my own haunted heart and the restless spirit of this place. That night, the forest seemed to come alive with voices on the wind. I lay in the cramped confines of my RV, its interior barely lit by a solitary sputtering lamp, and listened as the whispering voices outside grew in intensity. At first, I convinced myself they were merely the rustling of the trees, but then I heard the unmistakable sound of soft footsteps circling the vehicle. The radio crackled with an otherworldly static as if trying desperately to broadcast a message from a forgotten era. I forced myself to sleep, though my mind churned with images of spectral faces and eyes that seemed to peer in from the darkness. In the following days, I resolved to explore the area more thoroughly. I took long walks along the narrow, winding trails that cut through the forest, my only companions the muted calls of distant birds and the steady crunch of leaves beneath my boots. Each step I took was accompanied by an increasing sense of unease, as if I were trespassing on sacred ground. In one such excursion, I stumbled upon an old, dilapidated outpost, a structure that looked as though it had been abandoned for decades. Drawn by a compulsion I couldn't quite explain, I pushed open the creaking door and found myself in a small room lined with dusty shelves and faded photographs of a bygone era. Inside a battered filing cabinet, I discovered a collection of yellowed documents that told the tragic story of a young woman named Elizabeth. According to local records and newspaper clippings tucked away in a brittle folder, Elizabeth had been a vibrant, compassionate soul whose life was cut short under mysterious circumstances in the early 1900s. Accused of witchcraft and branded a heretic by a fearful, superstitious community, she had been brutally murdered by those who could not accept her wisdom. The story told of a curse that left her spirit restless, doomed to wander the forests, seeking justice or perhaps simply longing for redemption. As I read her story, I felt an inexplicable connection to her suffering, as if our fates were somehow intertwined. That evening, as a violent autumn storm began to gather on the horizon, I returned to my RV with the weight of Elizabeth's tragic tale heavy on my mind. The wind was growing fiercer, howling through the trees like a chorus of lamenting voices. I sat by the window, clutching the tarnished locket in my hand, and tried to piece together the fragments of my own shattered memories. In my dreams that night, I saw Elizabeth. In the depths of sleep, her spectral figure emerged, a translucent form clothed in a simple old-fashioned dress, her eyes brimming with sorrow and accusation. I awoke in a cold sweat, my heart pounding, the image of her face seared into my memory. Over the next few nights, the supernatural occurrences intensified. The RV's already unreliable electrical system began to fail more frequently, plunging me into darkness at the most unnerving moments. I heard soft, mournful whispers just outside the thin walls of the RV, and the distinct sound of footsteps pacing back and forth around my parked vehicle. Each time I ventured out with my camera and notepad, once a tool for capturing truth and evidence during my days as a journalist, I found nothing but shifting shadows and the lingering scent of old perfume, as if carried on the wind from another era. The more I tried to document these strange happenings, the more my rational mind began to buckle under the weight of doubt. Was I truly witnessing the ghost of Elizabeth, or were these apparitions merely the manifestations of my own internal torment? I found myself questioning everything I had ever believed about reality. The line between the tangible and the ethereal blurred with each passing hour, and my solitude on the Mendocino Ridge became an inescapable mirror reflecting my deepest fears and regrets. One particularly tempestuous night, with rain lashing against the RV and thunder reverberating through the forest, I decided I could no longer ignore the pull of the unknown. The storm had grown fierce enough to force me out of the confines of my increasingly oppressive mobile sanctuary. I stepped out into the driving rain, clutching a battered flashlight in one hand and the tarnished locket in the other. The cold wind bit into my skin as I made my way toward a ridge that overlooked a small clearing, where the supernatural energy seemed to concentrate. Every step felt weighted with dread, as if I were walking the narrow path between life and something far more sinister. As I reached the ridge, the storm reached its crescendo. The wind howled like a chorus of anguished souls, and the rain blurred my vision into a wash of gray. In that moment, I saw her clearly, a spectral figure standing alone in the clearing. Elizabeth stood before me, illuminated by intermittent flashes of lightning. Her eyes, full of sorrow and an inexplicable intensity, locked onto mine. For a long, heart-stopping moment, time seemed to freeze as I beheld the full manifestation of the tragic ghost whose story I had so painstakingly uncovered. Her presence was overwhelming, a tangible force that pressed against me with the weight of a century's worth of grief and injustice. I could feel her pain, a raw, unfiltered anguish that resonated deep within my own soul. In the raging storm, with nature itself screaming around us, I found myself trembling, not just from the cold, but from the realization that I was face to face with a force that transcended my understanding of life and death. The encounter was both physical and psychological, as the spectral Elizabeth regarded me with an expression that blended mourning and accusation. I felt compelled to speak. My voice, hoarse from disuse and laden with years of unspoken sorrow, emerged in a whisper, carried away by the wind. "I'm sorry," I managed to say, each word heavy with the weight of my own guilt. "I've carried too many regrets for too long. I'm here to make amends, to understand, and maybe in some small way to heal." For a heartbeat, the storm seemed to pause, as if nature itself were listening. The spectral figure's eyes softened, and the furious energy around her ebbed into a quiet, sorrowful calm. I stood there, drenched and vulnerable, as the ghostly apparition took a tentative step closer. In that charged moment, it felt as though Elizabeth's presence was not meant to harm me, but to confront me with the unresolved pain of my own past. I recalled fragments of my earlier life, the relentless pursuit of truth, the stories that had both defined and haunted me, and the personal failures that I had buried beneath layers of skepticism and cynicism. All of it came flooding back as I locked eyes with her. I spoke again, my voice gaining a measure of strength as I poured out words of apology, not only for my own failings, but also for the collective injustice that had condemned her to such a tragic fate. "I know now," I said, voice trembling, with emotion, that some wounds never heal until we face them. I am so sorry for what happened to you. I promise to remember your story, to honor it, and maybe even help bring some measure of peace to both of us. For what felt like an eternity, I stood there in that torrential downpour, pouring my heart out to a spectral presence that embodied all the sorrow of a forgotten past. The storm's fury gradually gave way to a tentative quiet, as if the elements themselves were moved by the raw honesty of my confession. In that suspended moment, the ghost of Elizabeth seemed to waver. Her eyes, once filled with searing intensity, now glistened with something akin to relief. A tear, a single luminous tear, traced a path down her translucent cheek before she slowly began to fade into the dark embrace of the night. I watched, speechless, as her form dissolved into the swirling mists, leaving behind only the echo of her sorrow and the persistent sound of the rain. The encounter had left me trembling, not only from the physical cold but from the shattering realization that I had been granted a chance at redemption, a chance to reconcile my past by bearing witness to the truth of a long-forgotten injustice. In the days that followed, as the storm subsided and the forest returned to its somnolent quiet, I remained on the Mendocino Ridge, haunted by the encounter and determined to piece together every fragment of Elizabeth's story. I spent long hours poring over old documents at the local archive in a nearby town, interviewing residents whose faces betrayed a lifetime of memories and regrets. Their accounts painted a picture of a community steeped in fear and superstition, where a brilliant, compassionate young woman had been wronged and then erased from history by the cruelty of a society too afraid to embrace change. The more I learned, the more I felt a deep personal responsibility, a duty to honor her memory and to confront the ghosts of my own past. The RV, my only shelter in that wild, remote place, remained a constant reminder of my vulnerability. Its flickering lights and creaking engine were not just mechanical failures, but symbols of the decay that had seeped into every aspect of my life. Each time the radio fell silent or the power flickered, I was jolted back to the realization that I was alone with my regrets and the specters of a history that refused to be forgotten. Slowly, over the course of several weeks, I began to document my experiences, not as a journalist chasing a sensational story, but as a man seeking to understand the profound connection between personal grief and the ancient wounds of the land. I wrote tirelessly, my journal becoming a repository of raw emotion, detailed observations, and the unvarnished truth of my encounter on that stormy night. Every line I wrote was a step toward reconciliation, an attempt to mend the fractured parts of my soul while also giving voice to a tragedy that had echoed through time. One crisp morning, as I prepared to leave the clearing that had both tormented and redeemed me, I took one last walk along the ridge. The forest was bathed in a pale, wintry light, and a quiet peace had settled over the landscape. I paused by a weathered tree that bore faint, almost imperceptible carvings, symbols that to me now spoke of both sorrow and hope. Clutching the tarnished locket in my hand, I felt the presence of Elizabeth once more, not as a vengeful spirit, but as a reminder of the healing power of acknowledgement and forgiveness. I left the Mendocino Ridge with a bittersweet awareness that the supernatural encounter had irrevocably altered my life. I had come seeking solitude and escape, but I found something far more profound, a confrontation with the deepest parts of my being. The ghost of Elizabeth, with all her tragic sorrow, had forced me to face my own demons and to begin the long, painful process of healing. Though I knew that the scars of that encounter would never completely fade, I also recognized that they had become a part of me, a testament to the truth that sometimes redemption can only be found by confronting the past head-on. Now, as I drive on distant highways, the memory of that stormy night on the Mendocino Ridge remains a quiet but persistent echo in my mind. I often catch myself glancing at the rearview mirror, half expecting to see a fleeting glimpse of a spectral figure in the twilight. And while I can no longer explain the inexplicable phenomena that once shattered the boundaries between the living and the dead, I carry with me the knowledge that some encounters are meant to heal rather than to harm. Elizabeth's legacy and my own journey toward absolution will forever be intertwined with that wild, haunting corner of Northern California. I continue to write about what I experienced, not for fame or to sensationalize the paranormal, but as a reminder that our past, both personal and collective, demands to be remembered and reconciled. The forest still whispers its ancient secrets, and on quiet nights I sometimes hear the faint sound of a gentle, sorrowful lullaby carried on the wind. In those moments I no longer feel the sting of regret so acutely. Instead, I am reminded that in acknowledging our darkest memories, we open the door to healing. And though the ghost of Elizabeth may be gone, her story, and the lessons she imparted, remain etched into my heart forever. That is my truth, the account of a man, broken yet brave enough to face the echoes of a tragic past and the spectral presence that forced me to confront the ghosts within. It is a story of isolation, of regret, and ultimately, of redemption. Even now, as I steer my RV along unfamiliar roads, I carry the memory of that transformative encounter with me, a quiet beacon of hope amidst the lingering shadows. My name is Travis Cooper, and I'm 29 years old. This happened in the heart of Owens Valley, California, a place as unforgiving as it is mesmerizing. I had just left behind a bitter breakup and a life filled with lingering regrets, determined to prove to myself that I was more than my past. I craved isolation, adventure, and the thrill of surviving on my own terms. So I loaded up my battered RV, a clunker with a stubborn engine, a malfunctioning air conditioner, and a generator that coughed more than it cooperated, and drove into the vast barren expanse of the Owens Valley Desert. The journey itself was a heady mix of excitement and defiance. I scoffed at the old legends and superstitions that local folks whispered about. I prided myself on being a practical man, a survivalist who trusted modern technology and his own skills to overcome nature's challenges. As the sun dipped below, the horizon and the desert sky transformed into a tapestry of stars. I felt a surge of anticipation. This was my chance to start anew, to prove that I could outlast both my demons and the harsh elements of this ancient land. When I finally reached the remote RV site, I was struck by the eerie silence of the desert at night. My campsite was set on a flat expanse near a craggy outcrop, with a dried creek bed stretching off into the distance. The surrounding rock formations, etched by time and wind, bore mysterious petroglyphs, symbols that seemed to merge indigenous, motifs with designs I couldn't quite place. I shrugged off a shiver that wasn't entirely due to the cooling night air and set about establishing my temporary home. The RV's interior was cramped and dimly lit by a single flickering lamp. I wrestled with the stubborn air conditioner, trying to coax it into working even as the temperature outside fluctuated wildly. For a while I felt in control, a lone man against the vast, indifferent wilderness. But as the first night deepened, a feeling of unease began to creep in. Around midnight, as I sat outside the RV trying to catch a glimpse of the starry expanse, I heard a deep, guttural rumble that vibrated through the silent desert. It wasn't the sound of a passing vehicle or a minor mechanical hiccup. It was something far more primal and unsettling. I paused, straining to determine its source, but the sound receded into the distance as quickly as it had come. I told myself it was just the wind sweeping over the barren landscape, yet the hairs on the back of my neck prickled with a sense of foreboding. The next morning, the desert greeted me with an almost oppressive heat, the kind that makes the air shimmer with the weight of the sun. Determined not to let the strange noise ruin my spirits, I set out on a short hike around the perimeter of my campsite. With my boots crunching on the sun-baked earth, I circled the area, keenly observing the odd patterns on the rocks. It was then that I stumbled upon something that made my heart quicken, a set of inexplicable tracks in the sand, leading away from my sight in a deliberate, almost human-like pattern. Next to the tracks, on a flat rock surface, I found weathered symbols carved deep into the stone. They were unlike any natural markings I'd seen before, a fusion of ancient indigenous art and something disturbingly occult in design. I took several photos with my phone, though the images came out blurry in the harsh light. Back at the RV, I tried to shake off the growing sense of disquiet. I powered up my ham radio, a piece of reliable old technology that I always carried with me, expecting to catch a bit of static or a snippet of conversation from a nearby channel. Instead, as I tuned through the frequencies, I heard something that froze my blood, a distorted, almost garbled voice as if coming from another world, whispering my name over and over. Travis. Travis. Leave this cursed land. I fumbled with the dials, but the voice was persistent, chilling in its clarity. My skin crawled, and for a moment, I felt the first true prickles of doubt about the rationality I so fiercely clung to. That night, the desert transformed yet again. The clear, star-filled sky gave way to ominous clouds, and a brisk wind picked up, carrying with it fine grains of sand that whipped at the RV. As I sat huddled inside, listening to the generator sputter and the radio emit fragmented warnings, I couldn't help but feel that I was not alone. Shadows danced outside the small windows, shapes that seemed to move with intent and purpose. The once reassuring hum of my RV now seemed like a fragile barrier between me and an ancient force that was stirring in the darkness. The following morning, driven by equal parts curiosity and trepidation, I decided to explore the area beyond my immediate campsite. With a worn map in hand and my trusty camera slung over my shoulder, I ventured out towards the rock outcrop where I'd first noticed the strange carvings. As I trekked across the cracked earth, the desert's heat was almost unbearable by day, yet the air carried a silence that was almost tangible. I felt as though I was trespassing on a sacred space, where every rock and grain of sand held memories of the past. It wasn't long before I discovered something that deepened the mystery. Partially buried in a crevice near the base of a large boulder, I found an old, leather-bound diary. The pages were yellowed with age, and the handwriting was frantic and uneven, as if penned by a man in the grips of terror. The diary belonged to a prospector who had roamed these parts decades ago. According to its entries, the prospector had encountered inexplicable phenomena in Owens Valley, a vengeful spirit that roamed the desert, exacting a terrible curse on anyone who dared to disturb its ancient resting place. The entries described the spirit as a demonic shifting figure with eyes that burned like embers and a presence that chilled the soul. The diary recounted strange occurrences, voices in the wind, eerie lights that danced on the horizon, and the sudden drop in temperature that would send shivers down even the steeliest spine. I couldn't help but shudder as I read the final entry, where the prospector pleaded for anyone who found his writings to heed the warnings and leave the valley, before it was too late. Back at the RV, I sat in the dim light of the failing generator, the diary clutched tightly in my hands. I had come here to prove my self-reliance, to show that I was unafraid of ghost stories and ancient curses. But as I read those desperate, handwritten words, I felt my confidence begin to crack. The rational part of me fought back, insisting that the diary was nothing more than the ramblings of a man who had been driven mad by isolation and the harshness of the desert. Still, a gnawing uncertainty took root in my mind, a whisper that maybe, just maybe, the legends were more than mere superstition. That night, the desert turned cold and hostile. As I lay in the cramped space of my RV, the temperature plummeted, inexplicably, a stark contrast to the relentless heat of the day. I wrapped myself in an extra blanket and tried to ignore the feeling of being watched. But the silence was broken by odd, intermittent sounds, a soft scraping against the side of the RV, the distant echo of footsteps crunching on gravel, and that same low, guttural murmur that had haunted me the previous night. My heart pounded in my chest as I reached for my flashlight and stepped outside, determined to catch a glimpse of what lurked in the darkness. The beam of my flashlight cut through the swirling sand, revealing nothing but the undulating dunes and jagged rock formations. Yet I couldn't shake the impression that something was moving just beyond the edge of the light. I stood there for several agonizing minutes, listening to the wind howl around me and the faint, disembodied whispers that seemed to emanate from the very earth. Every instinct screamed at me to return to the safety of my RV, but I also felt an inexplicable compulsion to understand, to document this strange, unsettling phenomenon. Over the next few days, the phenomena only grew more intense. During the day, the desert seemed to mock my attempts at rational explanation. Shadows flickered at the edge of my vision, and I began to notice fleeting images in the distance, shapes that moved with impossible speed, vanishing when I tried to focus on them. At night, the air turned unnaturally cold, and the RV's mechanical failures became more frequent. Doors would slam shut on their own, and the windows would sometimes shatter without warning, as if struck by invisible forces. My once reliable ham radio now emitted anguished, distorted messages at random intervals, snippets of voices that warned me to abandon this cursed land and never return. Each new occurrence chipped away at my long-held skepticism, forcing me to confront the terrifying possibility that something ancient and malevolent was stalking the desert. One evening, as a violent sandstorm began to gather on the horizon, I sat in the RV trying to gather my thoughts. The storm's roar was approaching fast, its fury a promise of chaos. I remembered the diary's final passages, accounts of a ritual, a primitive rite of protection that could, in theory, repel the vengeful spirit. The instructions were vague and scattered, but desperation lent them clarity in my mind. I scoured the diary for every detail, my pulse quickening as I pieced together a rudimentary plan to defend myself if the supernatural force made its presence known. The sandstorm hit without warning. The RV shuddered under the relentless assault of wind and grit, and I was forced to secure everything I could before the tempest engulfed me. Outside, the desert was transformed into a whirling vortex of sand and noise. The air was so thick with grit that it stung my eyes, and I could barely hear my own thoughts above the storm's howl. I clutched the diary close and retreated into the relative safety of the RV, though I knew that hiding inside a failing machine wouldn't protect me from whatever was out there. It was during the peak of the storm that I first saw it, a shifting figure, half glimpsed in the swirling maelstrom. For a split second, between gusts of sand and flashes of lightning, I caught sight of a demonic shape with eyes that burned like molten coals. The figure was not entirely human. Its form wavered and contorted, as if it were made of living shadow. I felt a primal fear grip me, a terror that transcended all rational thought. My mind raced back to the diary's warnings, and I realized that I was no longer simply a skeptic challenging old legends. I was facing something that defied explanation. In a moment of sheer adrenaline, I bolted from the RV, driven by a survival instinct I didn't know I possessed. The storm was chaotic, and I stumbled blindly across the dunes, my only guide the frantic beat of my heart, and the whispered instructions from the diary echoing in my mind. I had to reach higher ground, somewhere where I could think, where I could prepare for the inevitable confrontation. The sand whipped at my face, and the wind nearly tore my clothes from me, but I pressed on, every step a desperate bid for survival. As I neared a rocky outcrop that offered a modicum of shelter, I paused to catch my breath and assess my situation. The raging storm obscured everything, yet in the fleeting intervals between blinding gusts, I saw the demonic figure advancing. Its form was ghastly and shifting, emerging from the darkness like a living nightmare. The diary had mentioned a ritual of protection, a set of primitive actions designed to ward off the ancient curse. I fumbled through the pages, recalling fragments of incantations and the arrangement of natural objects that could serve as talismans. All I had were a few salvaged tools from my RV, some scrap metal, and the raw determination to survive. I set to work as the storm battered me, finding a sheltered nook among the rocks. With trembling hands, I gathered a handful of smooth stones, a length of wire, and even managed to salvage a broken piece of mirror from the shattered remnants of the RV's window. The instructions in the diary were cryptic, but they spoke of creating a barrier, a symbol of defiance against the forces of darkness. My rational mind rebelled at the notion, but in that moment when the supernatural was tearing at the edges of reality, I had no choice but to try. I arranged the stones in a rough circle, positioning the piece of mirror at its center as a focus point. I spoke aloud, reciting the incantations as best as I could from the faded handwritten words of the diary. The wind screamed around me as if in response, and the sand swirled in chaotic patterns. For a moment I thought I heard a low, mocking laugh in the wind, a sound that chilled me to the bone. But I persisted, every syllable a defiant cry against the encroaching darkness. Then, as if the universe were holding its breath, the demonic figure appeared again. This time, more defined. It charged toward my makeshift barrier, its eyes ablaze with an unholy fire. I felt a cold dread seep into my bones as it drew nearer, its form distorting the very air around it. The storm reached a fever pitch, the roar of the wind blending with the sound of my pounding heart. In that heart-stopping moment, I braced myself for the confrontation I had both dreaded and anticipated. The entity slammed into my barrier with a force that shook the ground. The stones rattled, and the mirror fragment shattered with a spray of tiny, glittering shards. For a few agonizing seconds, I was paralyzed, unable to move, caught between terror and disbelief. The creature's presence was overwhelming, a surge of raw, ancient fury that threatened to consume everything in its path. I felt as if the desert itself were crying out in anguish, the wind carrying the screams of forgotten souls. Then, as suddenly as it had struck, the entity recoiled, as if the improvised ritual had stung it. It circled the barrier, its eyes locked onto mine, and emitted a sound that was part roar, part wail. I could feel its malice, its deep, unyielding hatred, but also a strange sense of torment, as if it were bound by a curse that twisted its very nature. Summoning every ounce of courage, I repeated the incantation, louder this time, defiant in the face of the abyss. The creature paused, and in that moment of silence I realized that I was not simply fighting for my life. I was fighting for my very soul. My heart thundered in my chest as I watched it waver, its form flickering like a candle flame in the wind. The storm, as if acknowledging the fierce battle unfolding, began to subside ever so slightly. The entity's aggression diminished, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, it began to retreat into the swirling sands from which it had emerged. I stood there, drenched in sweat and dust, my body trembling from the ordeal. The desert had given me a grim lesson, a reminder that the legends and ancient warnings were not mere superstition but echoes of a time when the forces of nature were raw and untamed. I had repelled the demonic presence that night, not with modern technology or brute force, but with an improvised ritual born out of desperation and a willingness to confront the unknown. As dawn broke over Owens Valley, the storm had all but passed, leaving behind a landscape scarred by the fury of the night. I returned to my battered RV, every step heavy with the weight of the ordeal. The vehicle, already a symbol of my defiance against nature, now bore the marks of the supernatural encounter: a shattered window, a dented door, and a pervasive aura of loss. I sat inside the RV for a long while, listening to the quiet whispers of the desert morning, the earlier terror gradually giving way to a sober introspection. In the ensuing days, I struggled to make sense of what had transpired. I pored over the prospector's diary once more, searching for clues or explanations that might ease the gnawing uncertainty in my mind. The diary spoke of a curse, of ancient spirits guarding sacred lands, and of the dire consequences for those who dared to challenge the old ways. I had always prided myself on my skepticism, on the belief that nature's mysteries could be explained by science and logic. But now, as I drove away from that cursed campsite, I carried with me a deep and abiding respect for the forces that had nearly claimed my life. The scars from that night were not just physical, they were etched into my very soul. I had ventured into Owens Valley seeking solitude and adventure, only to be confronted by a reality that defied every rational explanation I once held dear. I left the desert with a battered RV, a mind forever altered by the encounter, and a heart that had learned to respect the ancient whispers of a land that had seen empires rise and fall. Driving away, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to catch one last glimpse of that shifting, demonic form lurking in the distance. The desert had taught me that some places are haunted not by ghosts of the past, but by the raw, elemental fury of nature itself, a fury that could be both destructive and transformative. I knew I would never be the same man who had once scoffed at old legends and dismissed them as mere folklore. Now, whenever I find myself in quiet moments, whether in the solitude of a long drive or in the stillness of a moonlit night, I remember the fury of that storm, the echo of that demonic roar, and the ancient curse that still lingers in the sands of Owens Valley. I have learned that survival is not just about physical strength or technological prowess. It is about humility, respect, and the willingness to confront the mysteries that lie just beyond the edge of our understanding. That experience, as harrowing as it was, reshaped my view of the world. I no longer take for granted the boundaries between the known and the unknown, or between science and myth. I carry with me the memory of that night as a constant reminder. Sometimes, in the relentless embrace of nature, the past and present collide in ways that force us to confront the very essence of what it means to be alive. And in that collision, there is both terror and a strange, undeniable beauty. A beauty that comes from the acknowledgement that we are but small parts of a vast, mysterious universe. As I continue on my journey, both on the road and within myself, I remain vigilant and respectful of the legends that endure. I have learned that sometimes the bravest act is not to dismiss the whispers of the ancient winds, but to listen, and in that listening, to find a path toward redemption, survival, and ultimately, a deeper understanding of the world around us. That is my truth, a testament to the night I faced the fury of Owens Valley, a night when the desert revealed its darkest secrets and challenged me to rise above my skepticism. I am Travis Cooper, 29 years old, and I will never forget the lessons that the harsh, timeless land of the Owens Valley forced upon me.